Hi, and welcome to our webinar on Canada's beef quality audit. I'm Stacey Domlewski. I'm the Science and Extension Coordinator for the BCRC, and I will be your moderator for tonight. Our session tonight should go for approximately 1 hour, but could last a little bit longer depending on the number of questions you have during our question and answer period at the end. If you are joining us on Twitter tonight, you can tweet along with us using hashtag BeefWebinar. I'll also be recording tonight's session, and we'll send out a link to watch the recording to everybody who's registered after the webinar. So if you do have anything you want to catch up again, you can. So for tonight's webinar, you will be able to hear and see our presenters, but we're not able to hear and see you. So if you do want to communicate with us, you can type in the chat window on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be able to see it. If you have any questions for tonight's presenters, either of them, that's where you'll type them in as well. And we'll answer all questions towards the end of the hour, but feel free to send in questions at any point in time. If your internet connection is being a bit slow, it may help to turn off anything else that's using your internet connection, especially any external hard drives. As well, if that still doesn't help, what you can do is close the webinar window, close the webcam window. So it means you're not going to be able to see tonight's presenters, but hopefully it'll make the audio come through and the slides load a little bit faster. So with that, we'll get started. So here's what we'll be covering tonight, and we'll jump right into our first speaker. So I will introduce our first speaker is Dr. Reynold Bergen. He's the Science Director for the BCRC, and his job in a nutshell is essentially to explain science to researchers and explain producers to researchers and research to producers.
Okay, tell me when I'm good to go.
Looks good to me.
Okay, I'm going to go through this really quickly here because probably many of you have heard this before. The Beef Cattle Research Council is the largest not-for-profit industry-led funder in Canada. And what we do is we set research priorities, we fund research that's of benefit to the industry, and then we communicate about what the results are. And we're funded by the National Checkoff. Now, these are producer funds we spend, and so it's producers who make the decisions about what projects get funded, what initiatives we get involved in, and they come from across the country, nominated or nominated by their provincial producer group. Now, this National Checkoff that funds us is used for two things. It's used for marketing and promotion and for research. The marketing and promotion is done by Canada Beef, and we do the research, and that National Checkoff is currently $1. And that's each provincial group decides how that dollar is allocated and how much of that dollar goes to the BCRC. And so it varies from province to province. On average, it works out to about 18 cents per head marketed. And this is really important because before the National Checkoff was in place, the beef industry essentially had to pass the hat whenever we wanted to fund a big initiative like a beef quality audit. And actually, the first two beef quality audits that were done in the mid-90s and the late 90s were funded that way. So the National Checkoff provides more regular and predictable funding to support research and tech transfer. So we bring all these dollars in, and what we do is we leverage them against government dollars. We use our money to pry out additional government funding so we can spread those producer dollars further and get more work done. And since 2009, we've done that funding through the Beef Science Cluster. And that's a collaboration between the beef industry and government funders. It allows us to match each industry dollar with 3 from government, and we can get more research work done that way. And we funded the 2 most recent quality audits through the Beef Science Cluster. And now the challenge with funding some big things like this through the science cluster is that after a while, it starts to look less like research and more like an ongoing industry initiative. But we got to keep those going, because things like the beef quality audit are great. They tell us where the industry can improve and where we can do better and how we can do better. But it's really, really costly to do these things. And so that's one example of why the national checkoff is soon to be increasing from $1 to $2.50 in the coming months in most places, and in some places it's already being collected at $2.50. Of that $2.50, 75 cents is being recommended to come to the BCRC. And this increased national checkoff will allow us to do a couple of things. And one is to just keep doing the work we're doing, things like the Beef Science Cluster, things like technology transfer. But it'll allow us to do more things too, like make sure that new researchers get hired in important positions when that needs to happen. It'll ensure that we have the funds we need to make sure that some industry level surveillance goes on things like AMR, antimicrobial use and resistance, animal health, on production limiting diseases, that kind of thing, and a variety of other things, VBP, Verified Beef Production Plus, as well as things like doing this national beef quality audit every 5 years. And now the National Checkoff Agency is actually having a webinar in about 2 weeks to talk about how the checkoff is used and about the upcoming increase. And so that's happening a week from this Tuesday, so 13 days from now. So tune in if you have questions or if you're curious about this. It's a great opportunity, some great speakers. I'm not one of them, so added incentive. And that's all I've got to say. So I'm going to turn this over to Stacy again, and then you'll get to hear about the latest beef quality audit from Mark, and we'll all get to find out if he's wearing that Cupid costume that he promised. So thanks.
Thanks, Reynold. So as Reynold mentioned, we will turn it over to Mark now. So Mark is the Director of Technical Services for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. A key focus of Mark's role is applied research, including projects related to production enhanced technology, beef safety and meat quality. Mark has also coordinated our beef quality audit since 2010 and has worked in the Canadian meat industry for the past 25 years, including roles in live animal production, processing, research, and marketing.
Hello, everyone. I understand that it's a special day for normal people called Valentine's. And if you're here, your secret is safe with us. I am going to go through a fair bit of material. And I know that many of you will want to look at this at your own leisure later on through the recorded version. And so that will enable you to take a little more time if you choose to do so. So tonight's presentation will basically cover two aspects. The first is what we call the beef carcass audit, and that was undertaken at Canadian slaughter plants. And the second is the tenderness and consumer satisfaction benchmark, which involves Canadian retail stores across the country. The purpose of the National Beef Quality Audit, as has been mentioned, is to benchmark progress, and not only to tell us where we are at present, but also to help identify opportunities to address some of the issues that we see. There will always be strengths and there will always be some areas that we can improve. And ultimately, our goal is to enhance the profitability of the Canadian sector, as well as satisfaction with our products. Obviously, a benchmark in its own right is not the complete job. We do these, I think, at most every 5 years, and sometimes it's been longer. So when we learn of the directions today that have been established as a result of this work, ultimately, a little bit of the future progress of the industry belongs to anyone that's listening today. And we all, with our cumulative contribution, I think, have the opportunity to make things better for the next round. which we hope will be at the end of this decade. I did want to mention that there is one final component underway of the National Beef Quality Audit, which relates to a survey of cattle producers, personnel at retail, as well as food service, and processors around, what they think of these results, what they see the quality priorities should be, and I also hope some suggestions on how we can do certain things better from the people that make their living in the sector. So I'll start out with the beef carcass quality audit portion of the presentation, and then we'll finish with the retail component. I'm going to give you a methodology in brief. The way that we have done this is in reality virtually identical to the way it's been done in the past. So if this is not your first presentation on this topic, you will be familiar with the way this works. I will give a bit more detail as we go through each attribute that was examined. But briefly, we made visits on a seasonal basis to Canadian processing plants that participated on a confidential basis. And I can tell you that the plants involved slaughtered more than 75% of cattle slaughter in Canada, so a very representative sample. These visits were made in the fall and the winter of 2016, and then a third set of visits in spring of 2017. And we had our technicians situated on the processing floor at a point immediately after the cattle were stunned, right at the knocking box, following removal of the hide, and also on the offal collection table. For the cooler portion of the audit, the data that we used was principally grading statistics supplied by the Canadian Beef Grading Agency, as well as instrument grading measurements. These are taken by the ribeye computer vision grading system. In all cases, for all the measurements that we're going to be talking about tonight, I want you to know that there is a minimum of 25,000 animals represented. So that's approximately 1% of Canadian slaughter. In some cases, it's significantly more than that, but that was the minimum observations that we made. The pricing and the costs of the quality defects, as has been our tradition, are put into dollars and cents. This year, we did something a little different in that we felt like we needed to adjust for inflation, because we are now able to look back all the way to 94 and 95. Historically, we haven't adjusted for inflation, but at this point, recognizing the length of time is now approaching far more time than we can just say that money's worth the same amount. We have done that. So if you have materials or historical reports related to the National Beef Quality Audit, you will find that the numbers given here as they relate to costs will not match those documents any longer. And that, of course, is because they've been adjusted to 2016 to $17. In an effort to make this a little more easy to follow, I've also used some color coding. Red is an indication that an attribute is now not doing as well as in previous audits. Green means that it is better, and no color, black, means that it's about the same. And we'll try to use those throughout. So we'll start out with the processing floor components, otherwise known as the kill floor, and then we'll finish in the cooler with the carcass grade components. The first thing that I'd like to talk about is TAG. And TAG, as I suspect you all know, relates to manure and mud and possibly even just our rumen contents on the hide. And what that means in practical terms is additional labor costs for the plant because they need to slow down the production line. There's possibly damage to equipment later on when that hide is made into leather. And while the science seems to suggest that more hide in the carcass does not invariably result in higher levels of O157. That was some research done by Dr. Joyce van Doskergoed. There is, of course, some potential for contamination in these situations. What we did is we assigned a TAG score to each animal that was observed. And that score ranged from 0 to 10. 10 being a very dirty and wet hide, the worst possible case scenario. And we assigned a score of 0 to 3 for the area and extent of TAG on each of 3 components, the legs, the belly, and the sides of the animal. And then we would add 1 additional point if that hide was wet rather than dry. So here's a graph of the results. In the bars, you have represented the 3 seasons that we visited the plants. And I think you can see intuitively, looking at the x-axis, which contains the TAG score ranging from 1 to 10, that the winter season was certainly associated with higher TAG scores across the board. A bit of a comparison here, which I will follow in the same format for all of the attributes, with the 2016-17 results on top, the second most recent audit on the bottom, and then again the color coding as I mentioned. So here we've got the fed animals, the non-fed, the 3 different seasons, and the total numbers of animals with TAG. Not to be confused with the score for animals that had TAG, but the number of animals as a percentage that had TAG. And our conclusion was that in the case of the fed animals, carcasses with TAG remained high. And it was approximately 85%, which was more or less identical to 2010-11. For the non-fed animals, the percentage of tags in cows and bulls was 57.3%, and you'll see that it's in red because clearly that's a lot higher than the previous result, which was 20.61%, and it is also lower than the fed cattle percentage of 85, as mentioned. So when we come to what this means in dollars and cents, we can see that in the blue bars that the costs of TAG over time, and in particular from this audit to the last audit, have increased. And again, that's almost exclusively due to fed animals. And you know what, it's not an insignificant cost. We're looking at somewhere in the range of $10 per head. Ultimately, this is a challenge because weather, as we know, is beyond the control of the cattle producer. What can we do about this? I think we know that it can be reduced by designing pens and working areas to enhance the drainage. We can use bedding materials, and we can clean those pens. But I think this would be an area of potentially additional research to see, are there new bedding materials that we could possibly use, maybe some other things, because at present I know this continues to be a significant issue for Canadian processing plants. Next, we'll talk a bit about horns. Horns cause economic losses from the bruising that they can cause in the live animals. They can result in condemnations of the head and extra labor in the packing plant to remove them. The way that we scored these was as follows. If they were less than 2 inches long, we called them skers. Those horns that were 2 to 3 inches long, we called them stubs. Those that were greater or less than or equal to 4 inches with a tip point were called tips. And those that were more than 4 inches with a sharp point were assigned as full horns in our data recording. And there you have a nice pie chart that sums it all up for the current audit, and you can see it looks pretty good. 91% of the animals were in the no horn polled category, whereas a full horn was present in only 2% of animals. So I think that's a pretty solid number. Indeed, when we take a look at the current audit and the previous audit in 10 and 11, we can see that it is a slight improvement. In the 2016-17 audit, 19.8 and 91.7 of the fed and the non-fed cattle were polled respectively, and less than 3% of the cattle had full horns. The percentage of polled cattle, we might say, is slightly higher than previously. It's up about 3%, and the non-fed 1%, which is probably within the margin of error, but certainly steady to better on this attribute. If we look over time at the last 4 audits, the news just gets better. You can see back in 94, 95, the situation with horns was dramatically different than it is today. And I think that's a testament to the commitment of the Canadian industry to dealing with this issue. The financial values may seem counterintuitive in that the dollar amounts are rising. 2 things to keep in mind there relative to the costs. That the costs have increased just due to the labor rates that we've been provided. And one caveat that is worth noting, I think, is that where horns cause bruising, in the case of the live animal, these costs would not be included. But nevertheless, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 cents per head for the industry loss due to horns. Next, we're going to talk about body condition score. And it's logical that has implications for both the carcass as well as the live animal, in this case, fertility in cows and quality grade in the carcass. When we were observing these animals, we assigned a body condition score ranging from 1, which was the thin end of the spectrum, to 5, which was grossly fat or overconditioned. And what we're really shooting for is that 2.5 to 3, which represents the ideal. So we've got, again, the current results the most recent audit results, the scores 1 to 5, where 1 represents a very thin animal, 5 represents overconditioned, and the average, which is the score on average. And what we found was that when we look at the non-fed animals, that we've made some good progress reflected in both the fall and the winter scores in reducing the number of very thin animals. You can compare 15.4 to 19.4 and 0.9% to 6.2. And not only that, we've also made some progress on reducing the number of overfed animals. In the fall, we were at 0.7% versus 4 previously, and again at 0.7 versus 4.3. So that is good news. And it's probably fair to say that the average cow now in the herd is pretty much at what we would recommend, in between that 2 and 2.5 to 3 range. In the spring, maybe a little outside of that, but pretty good all around. The fed cattle continue, as they were in 2010-11, to be on the fatter side. The scores are, over 4 in most cases, and that, as we will see in the relatively near future here, has implications for quality grade. This is just gives you a perspective over time in the last 3 audits, and I'll just draw your attention to the 3, which was closest to the ideal on this graph, represented by that green range. And for fed cattle, we can see that it has, at least relative to the 1998-99 audit, the number of animals that are in that sort of ideal range has really decreased. And again, that has financial implications. The non-fed, as we mentioned, is a very positive story. And you can see there in the blue portion of that stacked bar graph how those very thin animals represented by the blue color have decreased over time since 98-99. Next, we have livers. And I think many of you will be familiar with the issues. In essence, it's that an abscessed liver cannot be sold for human consumption. And depending on the severity of it, it can either be used for pet food or condemned. And this also has implications for live animals. The research on this is not as clear as some topics. There are those that are very knowledgeable that believe that from a feedlot perspective, there really isn't a clear performance penalty. There is a very clear loss to the packing plant, though, when these livers can't be sold. So we use the Elanco scoring system. 0 is no abscesses. A is 1 or 2 small unorganized abscesses, or 2 to 4 well-organized abscesses, and A+ is obviously the more severe end of the spectrum. Just to note here, if you're looking at historical results, the scoring system has now combined A- and A. So we've eliminated one category. So here is, again, a nice pie graph that summarizes what happened to the livers that we followed in our observations. And you can see that 68% of the livers were good for human consumption. Almost a quarter were condemned, and the remainder went to pet food. As has been our tradition, we've got the 2016 up top and the 2010 on the bottom. And when you look at those A+ livers, in other words, those more severely affected livers, almost across the board, whether it's fed or non-fed, you see those red numbers indicating that the numbers are increased relative to the last audit. There was one departure from that trend. In the winter for fed cattle, we were at 13.5 versus 16.1, which was an improvement perhaps, but overall the trend was clear and not positive. Here are some stack bar graphs to give you an indication over time. And as you can see, that green area represented in the bar graph here, here, and here keeps getting a little bit larger. That was for the fed. On the non-fed, particularly on the last two audits, we also see a smaller green area representing A+ livers turning into a larger one. So it's not surprising then that the industry loss from liver issues is significant. These costs do assume a loss at the feedlot, which has been the historical measure that we've used, as well as a packing plant component. If we went with the view that packing plant performance is no doubt impacted, but perhaps not so much at the feedlot, that number would be reduced. But I think either way, it's clear that this is becoming more expensive for the Canadian industry. So livers remain a key area to be addressed. I was involved in working with one of our major processors in setting up a tracking system to help communicate these results on a regular basis to feedlots. I must say that has not resulted in the improvement that we would have hoped. In the future, I think there may well be other considerations beyond what we have today, and that relates to the antimicrobial aspects of control of liver abscesses. And I think we need to prioritize research in other means of controlling liver abscesses, not only to improve the situation, but also potentially in the longer run to replace some of our current measures. We don't anticipate that at the moment, but that always is something to keep an eye on. Next topic is injection site lesions. And as you might imagine, where you have an injection site lesion, you are going to have tough beef. And that needs to be trimmed. And when you trim, you have a loss of beef. So we did do some work earlier on that was released previously on internal injection site lesions. Today, I'm just going to talk about the surface injection site lesions, which is what we can see when we're at the processing floor. The internal injection site lesions have to be visualized by actually cutting meat into portions at a fabrication facility. So not practical to do on the kill floor. And you can see across the board here in the minor column that it is a consistent trend in red, meaning that for both the fed as well as non-fed, the minor injection site lesions were increased. It wasn't so bad for the major, but we still did have some periods where there was an increase, namely in the winter for non-fed as well as in the fall for fed. And there was that one bright spot in the fall for non-fed where it appeared that the major injection site lesions were decreased. This basically breaks down the most recent results by the categorization, which in this case was assigned as either a minor injection site lesion, a major, or a critical. Critical means essentially that the usability of the product is severely impacted, and in most cases it turns into something unusable. And the portion of the graph over here relates to the location in which that injection site lesion was found. and we have UTM or fed cattle in blue, and the non-fed in red. And we can see that the shoulder injection site in the non-fed is far and away the biggest issue. And that same trend, but to a lesser extent, was seen in the fed cattle. The good news is that, again, most of these injection site lesions were of the minor variety, not of the major variety. If we take a look at our historical comparisons, we can see that for fed animals, the injection site lesions have trended up since the last audit. For non-fed, it's really been since since 1998-99, where we've seen a trend, and all that translates, you might expect, into an increased cost, but in reality, the increase between the previous audit and this audit is smaller than you might expect, and the reason is just due to the nature of the injection site lesions more than the number. Where they're mostly minor, that's a smaller cost to the industry than if they're major. So we are looking somewhere in the range of that 75 cent mark. I think, to be precise, it went from 6.56 to 56 cents per head. Why is this happening? Well, that's something we'd like to explore in our survey with producers, but certainly there's a theory on the use of dart guns, and in particular, when you use these guns with more than the recommended amount of product in the dart. So if you exceed the recommendation for no more than 10 mils, this is a particularly problematic situation, and one where you might get an accumulation of medication at that site, and with potential implications for withdrawal times, etc. So certainly something to be avoided. Even though major surface injection site lesions are down, there is still an opportunity to improve on our total number, keeping in mind that now we have 1 in 7 non-fed animals that appears to have a surface injection site lesion. Next topic is brands. And as we all know, brands can damage the hide and ultimately impact the way that they can be used, and consequently the value at the tannery and the end user. Branding, in addition to the issues around temporary pain, can also be considered an animal welfare issue by some. The challenge is that sometimes this just isn't an option, and whether that be a lender or an insurance company or both, there are situations where a brand is just simply required. So during our audit, we assessed both the number as well as the location of the brands. Here is the graph, or the table, 2016, 2017, and you can see that in the non-fed, we've had a nice decrease in the number of brands relative to 2010 and 11. We have had an increase in the number of brands for fed cattle. And it's possible that that increase is unavoidable due to the requirements of lenders, etc., as mentioned. But I'd like to think that the increased application of brands on the rib is something that's avoidable. And unfortunately, the incidence of brands on the rib is nearly double what it was the last time. And that is the worst possible place for a brand. So we have here our historical trend, and you can see for the non-fed that we did move down, and for the fed in blue that we went a bit upwards. The long-term trend is still positive. And here we have the locations as well as the incidence of multiple brands, and it's nice to see that multiple brands is essentially nil for both the last two audits. The HIP brands, as you can see in purple, are going in one direction and the rib brands are going in the other. And obviously we'd like to see that rib brand prevalence be decreased. Here is the financial picture. We can see that the long-term trend on the cost is still down. One thing that's hurting us is the location of these brands. And as mentioned before, a rib brand has the most impact on the value of the hide because it's not on the peripheral edges, it's right in the center portions. So we're looking at somewhere in that range of $1.25 per animal for this attribute. So I don't think that there's a lot that we need to do in terms of research. It's more of a reminder on not branding on the rib. Maybe there are some other means of permanently identifying animals, but because it needs to be visible, that certainly does limit the technological options. Bruising is one of our last attributes on the processing floor. It requires trimming or in some cases even disposal of the entire primal or carcass in the case of non-ambulatory animals. And we scored these in the following way. Minor was a bruise that we might estimate would give you something around 0.66 pounds of trim to remove. A major bruise, which would be roughly 1.5 pounds, and a critical bruise, which should be over 3.2 pounds, possibly the whole subprimal. And we also indicated where these bruises were found, recognizing that the location of the bruises, be it the round, loin, rib, brisket, or chuck, is a critical aspect on how much that bruise costs the industry. So you can see here for our current results versus the previous audit that we've got a nice row of green figures indicating that for both UTM as well as OTM and the combined figure that there was a significant reduction in major bruises in this round. And that's a positive thing, not only for quality defects, but also for animal welfare. The total number of OTM bruises was also down from 85 to 63. The number on the fed side was very close to the same. Here is a breakdown of the locations where we found these bruises for fed cattle, and you can see that the round was the least affected, and the loin, which unfortunately is, was the high portion or high value portion, as well as the chuck, lesser so, and then the rib somewhere in between. Brisket, not an issue. Different pattern for non-fed cattle. Obviously, the absolute numbers of bruises was greater for non-fed cattle than fed. We did also see a more greater numbers of major bruises, and the round in this case was the most impacted, followed by the loin, with the rib and the chuck roughly equivalent. So looking at the industry losses, there has been an increase in the cost of the fed component of that bruising estimate, which is marked in blue. And that's increasing because of the rise in the value of the carcass, and as mentioned, where those bruises are. The non-fed bruising has improved since the previous audit. You can see that that red region is smaller, but we are still up from 98, 99. The causes of bruising, they are numerous. They range from rough cattle handling, issues with facility design, under overcrowding on the truck, compartment sizes, how the truck is driven during transport, narrow and low truck gates, slippery truck floors. And one of the things that we're going to be doing in an upcoming video series, which I'll talk about at the end on the National Beef Quality Audit results, is going a little more into that aspect. The challenge that we have with this is that the producer will lose money due to reduced carcass weight from trimming of bruises, but they won't necessarily know where those bruises were, or in some cases even that they had bruises. So we have been doing some research to identify bruising using what's called the whole camera or whole carcass computer vision grading system, which instead of taking a picture of just the ribeye, takes a picture of the whole carcass side. And really our hope is that we could use that camera to provide feedback to producers, and with the knowledge of where these bruises occurred, you might be able to narrow down at your operation or during transport, what it was specifically that was causing them. The challenge that we have in the real world is that not all plants have the hot camera, and where they do, that camera is located after the bruising has been trimmed. So we've actually been doing some work on seeing if we can detect the bruise even after it's been removed, essentially by the divot that's been left behind. And that is a challenge for minor bruises, but it gets increasingly better as the size of the bruise increases. So that brings us to the end of the processing part. The cooler audit results are shorter, and I'll go through them now. Yield grade is something that you'll see shortly is trending in a less than ideal manner. Packers are indicating across the board that when these carcasses get to the fab floor, there is a significant loss of yield. Much of that loss is external fat, which the consumer doesn't see at retail because they're trimmed to a consistent specification, whatever it might be, but it does represent a loss to the sector prior to that. And one processor I was talking to characterized it as the greatest value destruction ever. And you can see here a continuous line that ranges from the year 2000 to 2017. Yield grade 1, our highest yield grade, is in blue, and the trend is unmistakably down. Yield grade 3 is unmistakably up. So yield grade in 2016-17 for class 1 was about 37%. In 2010-11, it was about 52%. And then going back to the end of this graph at 2000, it was about 63%. So a very core attribute of the Canadian beef advantage, namely yield, is no longer what it once was. Ribeye area and fat depth are linked up with yield to a certain extent. I did want to point out here that ribeye areas are slowly getting bigger. In 94-95, our average was 84, and now we're at 93. And you might say, well, that's a good thing. Well, not always. When you are creating portion sizes, there comes a point when you cross the line of too much. And the fat depth is unequivocally negative in that it's up by 76% since the last audit. It's a lot of fat. Carcass weights are a huge part of all of what I've talked about so far, be it ribeye area, be it fat depth, be it yield grade. And you can see that in 2016-17, we were at 864, the last audit at 812, 98, 99 at 777, and 94, 750. The challenge is for processors is that they need every animal that they can get. And so, at least in Western Canada, there is a real reluctance to institute some of the traditional disincentives for producing heavier than desired carcasses. This is a graph that I think really paints a picture. The year 1975 to 2017, there's our carcass weight. You can see it dropped a bit in 2017, but on average, we're adding 7 pounds a year. Obviously, there comes a time when the genetics of the animal and management simply cannot continually put on efficient lean yield while weight is increasing at that rate. Now, quality grade has a positive story to tell for, I guess, the very same reasons that yield grade is decreasing, some of which might be an increase in the utilization of British genetics, heavier carcass weights. We have seen prime essentially double as a percentage since the last audit, and AAA is also up. Well, obviously something is down, and that's the AA. So that's a positive. Here's a historical picture over time, and you can see really it's been 2007 where things started to verge. A little bit of a retracement possibly due to the drop in carcass weights of recent, but a pretty clear trend to more AAA and less AA, and virtually nothing of single A, which is a good thing. In the perfect world, obviously we would be selecting for these animals. Highly marbled, high yielding, AAA yield class 1. But you can see here's a graph since 2002 that the percentage of those animals coming to market is dropping. Likewise, for AA and the highest yield grade also dropping, whereas for yield grade 3 and AAA, there is an increase. Dark cutting beef is an attribute that results in a significant loss to the feedlot, and for whatever reason, it seems to be trending upwards. We were at about 1.64%, and the current audit, 1.28 on the audit previous, and 0.84 in 98-99. Some of that might be due to changes in standards and other types of administrative things, but that has a real financial cost. You can see here east versus west, and over time that the west seems to be trending upward of late, maybe a little down in the east, but generally the east, for whatever reason, is higher than the west. So if we were now to sum up all of the quality, the defects that we talked about in the cooler related to grade and weights and yields, we would get a trend that is estimated to look like this. So one aspect that was a little hard for us is that, as I mentioned, packers are not putting on the traditional discounts for yield grade. If we applied those as we have in the other audits, we would get a cost of defects which would clearly be higher. If we say we'll accept that those penalties no longer apply, even though the animals in theory warrant them, then you get this smaller amount, which is essentially consistent with 2010-11. We've had a little trouble sort of figuring out what discounts apply and how best to extrapolate that to a national population. So the truth is likely somewhere in between these lines, and the cost of quality defects is probably slightly above what it was the last audit. This graph requires less interpretation. The cost of defects on the processing floor is rising and quite consistently year after year. So that is something that we don't like to see. Just going to finish with a little bit of information on the satisfaction and tenderness benchmarking that we did at retail. And in brief, we had 2,678 retail steaks. That's a lot of meat. 1,380 samples were given to consumers to take home and sample and give us a score. The other 1,298 we used for what I call objective testing, and that was done at AFC Lacombe. Half of it was used for a trained sensory panel, where basically you have people that are selected on their basis to detect differences in taste and texture that maybe the average person wouldn't. And the other half was used for testing in a laboratory. This meat was sourced from 75 stores from 18 retail chains, and it represented the majority of the market share in Canada. We had these cities here from Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, and 4 types of steak: inside round, cross rib, strip loin, and top sirloin. I'm not going to give you a lot of results from this because our time is coming to an end here, but I did want to, this is the measurements for individual steaks in terms of their depth in millimeters from 2001, which wasn't a time of an audit per se, but it was the first time we did this work. So from the consumer satisfaction perspective, so I've included it. And you can see that if we consider this green area, which it represents 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch as being the ideal, we're pretty safely below that for everything. And moreover, every time that we take this measurement, it seems like we're going down. And you could say, well, we went from 16.8 millimeters to 16.1. Maybe that's not a lot of difference, but we're talking basically a sample that we hope represents a population average. So that is significant. And as one person said to me today, you're barbecuing, you turn around to watch your kids, and before you know it, your steak is overcooked. And as these things get thinner and thinner, the risk of that happening just goes up and up. We also looked at tenderness just very briefly. The way we do that is we have a steak here, we take out cores, and we essentially put it in an instrument that forces a blade through it. The more force it takes for the blade to go through, the less tender the meat is. And these bars represent strip loin, top sirloin, cross rib, and inside round for the 3 years in question. And if you look at the green area, which is those steaks that we feel require no improvement in tenderness, you can see clearly that inside round, there's been a steady increase or a steady improvement. Likewise for cross rib, sort of the lower end of the market. Top sirloin, it seems to have leveled off, if you will. Some people might speculate that we're reaching the point where we really can't get much more tender, or perhaps we shouldn't, because we might risk getting into what some would describe as mushy. The strip loin, I'm not quite sure what happened there, but it did go down a bit. I'm not sure whether that was a statistical aberration or something real. This is kind of interesting. We, as part of this work, we did take some Mexican retail product that was in Canada, and we took strip loins and compared them to the equivalent product from Canada. And you can see the red area indicates those steaks that are in need of what we call significant improvement. That means more than 4.6 kilograms of shear force. And you can see a very clear difference between Canadian and Mexican product. Lastly, consumer satisfaction. This was evaluated by consumers taking steaks home and scoring them from 1 to 10. And essentially, if they gave a 7 or higher, we said that they were satisfied. In my mind, this is the ultimate measurement. As Marshall Field said, right or wrong, the customer is always right. And these are the scores that consumers have given us over the last audit. Obviously, the importance of these scores is never been higher in my mind. We have record high beef prices, and I think that equates to record high expectations that what you pay for is reflected in the quality of the product. So the year 2015, there was 79% of those 1,200 consumers that said they were giving the steak a score of 7 out of 10 or higher. And remember, that were 4 types of steak: inside round, cross rib, strip loin, top sirloin. In 2009, that was at 80%. That was a pretty good jump from 2001. My conclusion is that essentially we've maintained that improvement that we achieved in 2009. 79 and 80% are within the margin of error. So to wrap up, I think the cost of quality defects is increasing for the Canadian beef sector. Some, but not all of that increase is due to the increased costs of making a mistake, obviously related to the value of the beef carcass these days. Good news is the consumer satisfaction levels, perhaps the ultimate measure at the end of the supply chain, has been maintained. We do have an opportunity, I think, to sort of refocus on quality at the primary production level. In recent years, there have been many competing priorities for producers' attention. Be it sustainability, an increased emphasis on not using growth promotants, antibiotics, you name it. But at the end of the day, as Ford says, quality is job one, and it always will be. And we would be well advised not to forget that. So we will benefit, I think, from some investments in targeted research and communication to enhance industry practices, to enhance the results for the future. And in terms of next steps, we, as I mentioned, have the quality priority survey from the supply chain left to do. I hope we're going to get some good input on what can be done about some of these things that need improvement. We are going to have, I believe it's about 15 videos that are going to be of the short and sweet variety, each focused on an individual attribute with a little more information. And I think there will be an opportunity to communicate some of these findings through our traditional channel, which is Verified Beef Production, now Verified Beef Production Plus. And I think we can also do some benchmarking relative to some other countries that conduct a similar audit. So with that, I do want to thank the people that contributed to this effort. There are many of them. I have, I think, around 55 on this list. I know that there's other people involved. Some of these folks have been with me on this project for a number of audits, and I hope to see you again. Very much appreciate your work. And last but not least, we do need to acknowledge the people that made this possible: the Beef Cattle Research Council, the Growing Forward program from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and National Beef Checkoff. So with that, thank you for taking some time out of your Valentine's Day. And we have, I think, a little bit of time for questions, although I did go a bit over, so we'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. We do have some time for questions here. So we do have a couple coming in already, but for those of you that would like, if you haven't sent a question in already, you can type into the question box on the side of your control panel. If for some reason you're not seeing your control panel, you should have an orange arrow. If you click that, it will expand. So if you have questions for either Mark or Reynolds, type them in and I'll read them out. So the first question here, it was talking about the adjustments you made when you talked about adjusting for inflation. Were those made on cattle price or CPI?
Well, I would much prefer that you get that answer direct from the smart people that did the math from CanFax, but my understanding would be that it was done on CPI.
Yes, and I just saw Brenda typed in here that yes, it was. So when a liver is condemned, is the carcass condemned as well?
No, not necessarily. Most oftentimes, it would just be the liver.
Okay. So also on the topic of livers, were there any liver damage noted or attributed to liver flukes?
I think it was essentially zero.
The other question related to livers here, any suggestions as to why we're seeing the increase in liver abscesses?
Well, that is the question of the day, and I think whenever I've attempted to explore that with the feedlot sector, I'm told that it's most likely due to an increased reliance on higher energy rations, but I think that question needs further examination.
Right. So just to let everybody know who's typing in their questions, I've got about 3 left, and so if that's all I have, we'll wrap up after that. So if you do have a pressing question you want to get in, type it in right away. What does yield, I'm assuming it means, what is the correlation between yield and carcass grade?
I'm assuming that the question is, what is the correlation between yield and yield grade, not quality grade? In the case of Canada's yield grade, the yield grade is related to the proportion of what we call dissectable lean, which is really a scientist's term for if you took a carcass and you went at it with the scalpel and you took all the fat and all the lean and put them in a pile and weighed them. That's what our yield grades measure. The key thing I think we have to keep in mind is that we only have 3 of them. So essentially you have what I would call the average, above average, and below average system. We will shortly be moving to what I believe is a better system, which is not perfect, but it has 5 classes. So maybe we could correlate that more to the school grades analogy, an A, B, C, D, and F, which gives a little more feedback. And with that, we're moving to what's called a retail or usable retail definition, where yield is not so much related to dissectable lean, but the amount of the most utilized primals based on the definition that was established. In the long run, I would hope that someday this industry will pay on a percent lean rather than yield classes, so that every percent more that you contribute, you get paid a little more, and vice versa. Right now, in yield class 1, we can have as much as 55 pounds of lean yield between animals at the top and the bottom of that. And in no other industry would you not recognize that difference in product weight. Anyway, long answer, but hopefully that.
No, that's good. So I have a couple questions here coming in about different feeding systems. So asking about if the quality audit compares grass-fed or grain-fed or barley-fed versus corn-fed.
Well, just due to the limitations of time, I didn't present any of the results of one of the components of the quality audit, which was our national retail meat case study, where when we went around to these 75 stores from these chains, we wrote down in each of those stores the information on every single package of beef that was in the retail counter. And in that regard, we did sort of take note of the relative proportions of products that were claiming to be grass-fed versus corn-fed versus general grain-fed. So we captured that aspect. But I think what the question likely relates to was, is there any difference in the prevalence of the defect seen for animals coming from one of those 2 types of production systems? And the answer is no, we were not able to track that type of thing.
Okay. And what about fat differences between barley fed and corn fed?
Well, I think that at the end of the day, the differences between those systems is being overshadowed by the weight factor. So, historically, we might have thought of Canada as being a principally barley-fed kind of production, although obviously in Eastern Canada there's corn, and in the U.S. We might have said it was more corn, and historically we've had a yield advantage there. I don't think that that's necessarily because we feed barley, but I think that's where that kind of perspective often originated due to our historical advantage. As I said, as the carcass weights climb ever higher, I'm not so sure how much advantage we still have, but to be specific, we didn't compare directly between corn and barley in this audit. We don't have information on what happened to the animals before we observed them at the processing plant.
I have a follow-up question to the earlier question about yield. I was wondering about if you produce a AAA carcass, if we're therefore creating a carcass with a more outer layer of fat.
Not necessarily, but as the graph that I produced shows, it seems like our attempts to produce a AAA carcass that also is yield class 1 are not meeting with much success. So it is possible, but the trend is not in that direction for the overall Canadian production, but I think it's certainly possible.
Okay. Were lesions tested for specific antimicrobial or vaccines?
No.
And the last question here, was there a difference, or did you look at differences between hot and cold branding as far as susceptibility to the brand site? So I'm assuming as bruising or anything else.
No, we didn't, but certainly it is of interest to see from a hide perspective, would the usability of the hide be better with one branding method or another? I don't know that question, but I will commit to delivering you an answer in our upcoming video from our series, one of which will be focused on branding.
All right. Well, thank you very much to everybody who submitted questions. I think we'll end it there. I just have a couple more things before I let you go. The first is how to stay connected and get more information about the Beef Cattle Research Council, as well as the quality update. You can subscribe to our email list if you haven't already, as well as if you have a Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube account, you can follow along with us there as well. I would also remind you of our next webinar coming up will be about soil health for growing forages, and that's actually next week, so be sure to join us for that. As well as Reynolds mentioned our the webinar coming up about the checkoff increase and a little bit more about who's using the checkoff and what they want to use it for. So I will send out some additional information about that webinar as well. So shortly after the webinar, there will be a survey pop up, and I ask that you please do complete it. It just asks about this webinar as well as any ideas you have for future webinar topics. We do use this survey and we find it very useful so that we can deliver you information that's useful and meaningful to you on your operation. As I mentioned, I will be sending up a follow-up email with a link to watch the recording to this webinar, as well as some supplemental information and links to a lot of those different resources that Mark mentioned as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us here tonight. And on behalf of the audience, I want to thank you, Mark and Reynolds, for volunteering your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks.